Hey, common scientists, we're coming to you this week with the topic of freedom and responsibility. So, if you tuned in last time, you maybe heard a bit about this. If you're new today, here's the gist of it. We are common scientists. That means we do some research, we come to the table, and we try to better understand the topic at hand. So, this week we're diving into the idea of freedom and responsibility, or maybe freedom versus responsibility, depending on where our individual research led us. And the topic idea was brought to us by Mr. Aidan. I myself am Lauren, and then we have Dre as well. Aidan, what sparked your interest about freedom and responsibility? Do you have something to share with us?
So, it's something that I've thought about, and we had the cast on free will recently. But even before that, I was reading a book by Viktor Frankl, who's a psychiatrist, and he survived Auschwitz, and he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he said something along the lines, I couldn't find the exact quote, but he talked about how the US, so after the war, he moved to the US, and he talked about how in the US, we have this Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. It should be paired with a sister statue of responsibility on the West Coast. So that was the general gist of his quote. And that stuck with me because it just made me kind of really question this relationship between the two of freedom and responsibility. What is the tension, if there is one, between the two? And like what makes that important in our lives. But yeah, that's like kind of the context of it and where I was coming from in terms of choosing this cast.
Dre, do you believe that we are free?
No, like in respect to having free will, freedom of choice, not really. I think that there's too many limiting factors. I think our biology, our genetics, our ancestry, everything that sent the universe into motion, advertisements, things that are subliminally put into our heads every single day, interactions between individuals, parenting, everything that we didn't choose makes us who we are and impacts our decisions. So in a pure sense, I don't think so, no. But for the sake of conversation and practicality, I can talk about freedom and responsibility and even free will under an umbrella of like more deterministic thinking.
Okay, and when you say deterministic thinking, you mean?
I mean the idea that we are not purely free agents, as in we cannot just make an idea or a choice out of thin air. There's always going to be a cause to any action, any choice that we make.
Okay. And Aidan, your position on free will was a little different, yes?
A little different. I would agree with Dre that things are pretty laid out before us, and that there is like many influences that cause our own lives and how they unfold. I would like to think that free will exists, and I do think that it may exist, but you'd have to go to the free will cast to listen more on my philosophy about that. But I guess a little bit more in the middle, but not completely.
Yeah. I like this tension of freedom versus responsibility, though, for a few different reasons. But I think Viktor Frankl's quote, again, this Auschwitz survivor who wrote a phenomenal book that I've also read, talks about like a Statue of Liberty and then maybe a Statue of Responsibility. Why do you guys think we struggle with like freedom versus responsibility?
I think one aspect of it is that depending on how you look at it, freedom and responsibility, like they could necessitate each other, or they could be like opposites. Like you could have freedom from responsibility, which I think a lot of us, millennials, young adults, etc., just human beings, we kind of miss that childishness, that being a kid and being like, that was like the most free any of us ever were, because at the same time we were controlled by our parents. And if you had like a decent, some people had worse childhoods than others, but if you kind of had parents that, were loving, etc., there was this freedom because, yeah, you had to do what they say, you had a bedtime and all that, but at the same time, it wasn't the crushing anguish of like debt and having to go to a job every day and this and that. And even like school, of course, it does feel like a little bit of a prison when you're a kid, but looking back on it, it's like there just felt like there wasn't the general anxiety and even just the freedom of knowing like how the world really works. Like me, I was like a pretty innocent kid where I just had all these ideals and all that, and now those things are kind of, they don't crush me on a daily basis, but I'm like they're in my head, right? Like I understand that there's genocides all over the world, there's wars, there's genital mutilation, there's people starving while I'm living a great life in Minnesota, and all these blessings that I have that so many people, billions of people around the world don't have. So I think that you have a freedom from that as a child, all that knowledge and all that responsibility of holding that on like your heart and your daily actions. But that's only because there was like almost a deity, which is your parents, who are looking over you, who are responsible for you, and they take on all the responsibilities that you will eventually have as a free individual in the Western world, at least.
Yeah, I think that's well spoken. Do you have anything to add otherwise?
I think that it is fascinating, like the or and the and between freedom and responsibility. Like you're talking about how, as an adult, you have freedom and responsibility, but that can easily, be confused with like freedom from responsibility.
I read a study and I don't recall where it was from, but we'll link it in the show notes. And I'm curious what you guys think of this. So it was based on survey results, which also for any statistician out there and also for everyone else is biased because only certain people like opt in to take a survey, right? So with all that in mind, though, the survey found of this group of people that was questioned that when freedom was perceived, responsibility was not. And when responsibility was perceived, freedom was much less. Like the degree of freedom was smaller. Like another way to put that would be to say that the respondents believed the less freedom they had in a choice that they were making, the more responsibility they felt that they should have on that choice because of maybe like all of this programming. It's like if I have less perceived freedom in this choice, like I need to be even more responsible in making the right one, which I thought was fascinating. It was kind of backwards of what I had thought. And hopefully I'm doing it a little bit of justice in how I'm explaining it now. But basically and of course they didn't use the words freedom and responsibility, but definitions and scenarios over repeated like time. And that when people had the highest perception of freedom was when they made quick choices, and often quick choices were associated with like spontaneity and like dumb shit, like non-important. Like it's not like oh, like spontaneous, let's have a baby. Spontaneous, let's like not those decisions. It's like spontaneous, I'm gonna have a beer versus wine. Like I don't know. So I thought that was really fascinating, and it reminded me of what you just said.
Yeah. That is kind of the difficulty with these words, is that they can be taken and interpreted in different ways. So obviously, like, I'm really interested to see how this conversation goes, but I think at some points we might just need to clarify kind of what we're talking about. So I didn't read the study, obviously, so I don't know exactly what they're talking about. But one thing that was really interesting to me was, like you said, the bigger the decision, obviously the less spontaneous you're going to be. You're going to think about it more. And I don't know if this is what the study was looking at or whatever, but one way we can look at responsibility in this way is that as an adult, that there's more consequences for like something having a baby. There's going to be more responsibility if you do something like have a baby. So therefore, you're going to feel like there's less freedom because that responsibility is going to make you feel more bonded to something versus just like, oh, let's go to the lake today or drive it, whatever. That might feel like a more free decision because there really aren't any possible negative consequences or long-standing consequences that will happen. And, you know, I don't know. Yeah, that is really interesting. I guess that study had lost me for a second because of the counterintuitiveness of it, of how the correlation between responsibility and freedom. But
I like it. I mean, I was fascinated by it, and it made just a ton of sense to me because I am guilty of it too. Like, free to, and especially I think as an American, and obviously I've never lived any experience other than being an American, but I especially thought of like even my own tendencies of like, oh, masks are maybe not required at this venue based on what the venue said, but according to the CDC, they are required. And so in the Lauren that like wants to do the right thing, I would want to wear my mask. But in the Lauren that wants to be free, I'm like, I don't really want to wear my mask, so I'm just not going to wear my mask, where it's like, it's freedom at the cost of responsibility. So I don't know, it just made sense that like the less free you might be, the more responsibility you would take, or autonomy, or like agency in the decision. Yeah, kind of counterintuitive, but fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing both of your takes on it just reminds me of the amazingness that is the human mind, and just how we all think about it in completely different ways. Because the way that I thought about it, so Dre in particular, I think you're talking about like the responsibility that might come from the consequences.
mm-hmm.
The way I thought about it was like from like if you have, I mean, just from kind of a mathematical perspective, if you have 10 options versus 3 options, like the responsibility is just like the feeling that you have over the 3 options is that each of those 3 options, if you're like weighting them equally, just has more weight. And so would then like feel like you have more responsibility to make the right choice in that instance.
Mm.
Whereas if there's 10 options, it's like, oh, there's 1/10 responsibility for each of these options associated with these options. So it just like would feel then like you have less of a like reason to be responsible in making the choice, which yeah, is just like, I mean, just again, I don't know, just thinking about the different ways of thinking about the study. But yeah, it is a fascinating take though, for sure. Jay, what else did your research kind of reveal in terms of this dichotomy?
Yeah, so a lot of it was, I mean, I did some research on Sartre. Did you guys research Sartre at all?
No.
Okay.
Speaking of different approaches.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to get into that quite yet. Unless I'm more curious too, because I didn't research Frankl at all. So I was kind of curious on what his background was, or like, have you guys both read the book? What is it meaning?
So it's man's search for meaning. Yeah.
Okay. Obviously I know about his background, like in the concentration camps and all that, but I don't really understand like his greater worldview of why he felt like, why was it so important to him that the land of the free have this monument to responsibility as well, and like kind of what was he saying? If we're reading between the lines, is he saying that we are lacking that responsibility? Is he saying that freedom necessitates that responsibility? What exactly is your guys' interpretation of what he was saying?
Do you want to go first or second?
I want to go first.
Okay.
My interpretation, so Frankl was talking about that in the context of living meaningful lives. And according to Frankl, if you are able to live a meaningful life, you'll be happy. And that's kind of maybe simplistic, but in America particularly, a lot of people struggle for meaning, and he had statistics behind it. It was some crazy percentage. And for him, even in Auschwitz, he was able to find meaning by like particularly thinking of this book that he would write, and he had background in psychology prior to his experience in Auschwitz. And so my understanding of it, I think for him as a psychiatrist, I forget. Do you remember?
He was a psychiatrist,
was that he experienced the unhealthy side of freedom without responsibility, which to him I think manifested in a lack of meaning, because you had, and I think of Aidan's numbers choice, like because there is so many choices and it sometimes seemed like too many choices because we are so free, like people don't know who they are. And he even talked about like lack of culture or lack of understanding where they come from or ancestry because of all of the like ethnicities and things here. Like he says like even a man without meaning who doesn't know who they are, who has that, can go back home and say like, oh, I'm a Norwegian, you know. But if you are a man without meaning and you go home and you don't really know, I mean, because it's mom's from here, dad's from here, or you maybe don't know at all, you don't even have that to fall back on. And so he was, I think, referring to this frustration of a multitude of people with no meaning, and I think tied that to this idea of freedom with a lack of responsibility. So that's my understanding of the context that he was explaining that in.
I appreciate your context because it helped me with just remembering bits and pieces of the book. But just to provide some further context about Viktor Frankl, he is known for founding the logotherapy school of psychotherapy. I might be butchering some of the terminology, but logotherapy as an approach is focused around helping people find meaning. And so he is really focused on getting people toward living meaningful lives. And there were just a few different ways that he mentioned people could find meaning in their lives and sustaining meaning in their lives. And one was like bearing a heavy burden, like so through your profession, like through professional achievements, but then there's also like through your loved ones. So if you're living to help others make it through the day, like those are two of the more robust ways to find meaning over a long period of time. And so I think, and like with both of those, they're not really associated with convenience. And like this, in the US, at least my interpretation is that he is observing like the instant gratification culture and the like desire to get a quick fix, when meaning actually requires showing up each and every day and like persevering through your suffering, and like persevering through your suffering to serve a noble profession or like your loved ones. So I think that is my reading through the lines, partly beyond like the also the like numbers thing. Just if you have so many choices, like each one feels like less important. But yeah, so that's, I guess, my reading of it, and a little bit of extra context on Viktor Frankl.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm hearing a couple of different things. I'm hearing, number one, that too much freedom is a prison. right? If you have just unlimited choices, then you essentially have no choice. It's like it's overwhelming. You just overanalyze everything, every choice. Like you said, like it becomes so diluted. You have so many options that it's just like you run the risk of just choices seeming meaningless versus if you have a lower, yeah, interesting. But then, so with Franco, I don't know, I don't even know when this guy really was, like, is he still alive? I don't even know. But I would guess that he was coming into his philosophical prime, his career prime, writing this book somewhere around like postmodernism, and then also the not the Great White Flight, but essentially we're all, maybe it was the Great White Flight, where everybody started moving to suburbs, getting farther away from their families and stuff like that. Because it's really interesting to hear him kind of lament the fact that yes, Americans, we're getting too much freedom, right? We have too much mobility. We can live where we want. We can move away from our parents. We can run away from the responsibility. Because before you would live in a village, right? Historically, very small area, small town where you knew everybody. Most people were family. If they weren't family, you grew up with them, so they're pretty much family. You have a duty to them, a responsibility, and that is a type of prison, but it also gives you meaning, right? Mm-hmm. And then now it's like, now if I have issues with my parents, I don't like the way they raised me, I can just move 30 minutes away and I can just not see them if I don't want to. And it sounds like and then postmodernism, which is just the deconstruction and I guess just the destruction of labels and meaning, and how everything is just created by they're all social constructions and all this type of stuff. So and that's a whole nother type of freedom, right? And that seems to be a very American idea. I'm not saying that's where it came from, but it just seems to really jive with us. Like, yeah, we make our own purpose and this and that. And he's trying to, it seems like what I'm hearing, what I'm deducing, he's just like reeling us back in a little bit. It's like, all right, like, yeah, freedom is awesome. Like, we all love it, right? Like, we all, good that their slaves are free. It's good that the Holocaust was ended. It's good that, people don't go into prison. All that freedom's good, but it's like there is this other thing on the West Coast of America, or should be on the West Coast of America. It's a statue of responsibility.
I agree with your sentiment, and he even compares like the percentage. He's like, and I don't know if he was like making a joke. It kind of felt like it as a reader, but I mean, if anyone were to perceive his reading wrong, it would be me, because I'm way younger than him and I'm a woman and I didn't go through Nazi Germany, right? Like, so this could be totally off, but it almost seemed like a joke. He was like, yeah, I'm like, there's this major problem, and then we have this country who's like supposedly doing really well in all these ways, and like, here's their stats and here's Europe's stats. And it was like markedly different. Still a problem in Europe too, but like this percentage of people with meaning versus without meaning of what he was looking at was crazy worse for Americans. So I do think it was kind of some of that, like, yep, it's all good. Kudos to you, America. However, like, are you happy? Is anyone living meaningful lives?
Yeah, I think that is the risk that you run with too much freedom, is the freedom from everything. The freedom from responsibility, the freedom from bonds to loved ones, and then eventually it's the freedom from happiness, right? The freedom from meaning, a meaningful pursuit in your life. And I mean, we see that. It seems to me, obviously we're a prisoner of the moment, but it seems to me that is becoming more and more of a neurosis in our society, the lack of meaning, the lack of a meaningful pursuit. And probably that is going to be correlated with distancing yourself from your family and the people that you grew up with. But I don't know, I guess I feel like I need to read this book now. I wish I would have read it in preparation for this, but I guess like it's hard for me to get over it. Now I'm almost thinking I'm 29, right? So I am kind of over it, but I haven't necessarily reconciled it with my child, the child within me, and how I just remember just wanting to rebel against everything and just wanting complete freedom. And then obviously you grow up and you get smacked with bills and jobs and all that, and you're like, whoa, like freedom is responsibility. Like it is. Like as soon as you're like, oh, like I have my own house, I have this, I do whatever I want. It's like, oh, well, you thought you could do what you want, but you're not going to survive, right? Because they're whatever. So
we listened to a podcast recently, Aidan and I, and like similarly, I think too, we have this conception, this problematic conception of freedom and responsibility, but this was specific to marriage, where the woman on the podcast was talking about how men will buy these t-shirts that say, like, 10 more days of freedom or something, getting hitched on the back. And it was hilarious to her because men generally, like, are much better off being married. Like, the depression is less.
Right.
They're like, all these things they're eating
Life
is better. Their life expectancy goes up. Like, all these things. And she's like, why is it that, like, you're probably more free to live a better life than ever once you're married, especially as a man, but then once you're married, you perceive to be trapped. Like, you're probably more free, more healthy, living longer, right? Like, in all these ways. I don't know, what you just said reminded me of that.
Yeah, I think an ill-conceived philosophy of freedom has definitely had a deleterious effect on America, specifically probably on men. Like, I'm not saying it's not everybody, but just I'm a man. I know a lot of men, so I'm just like how I can view it in a more like kind of a way that seems truer to me. I wouldn't, really try to apply that to women as much. I suppose I would allow you to do that. I suppose in this context, I don't feel as confident doing that, but I definitely think it is true, and I think like I said, I think it's just it's like an immature idea of freedom. It's not the understanding, as Sartre says, like total freedom is total responsibility. And that is it seems like a paradox. It's like, what do you mean? Like, I thought I was supposed to be free from these things. But it's like, no, once you have the free will, once you have the freedom of choice, now you're responsible. If you were a prisoner, we could never hold you responsible. It's like, it's whoever your master's fault. It's the government's fault. It's whoever's fault. It's God's fault. If that's who's controlling your actions, it's society's fault. But once we acknowledge as a society, community, nation, as America has, that we are free, we're the land on the free, that's where we have now this complex where, oh, that means like total responsibility. And that goes back to the Free Will podcast where I talked about we really want, I think it's very human, but it's definitely super American. We really want to put blame on people. We really want people to be at fault. We really want people to have responsibility for things. And that's where I just kind of like recoil. I'm like, hold on. Like, there's so much complexity to decision making and how people's lives end up and this and that. So I'm just like, that's where I think it definitely gets a little psychotic or like neurotic. And I love freedom. I live in the land of free. I'm very happy at the time and place I was born. I could have been born 100 years earlier and been in a much worse position. But I think because we do truly believe, like Sartre says, this total freedom that we think we have as Americans and we try to strive to have, it leads to total responsibility. And then I think that when it gets a little bit gross is where we start, like, instead of just saying, oh, I'm responsible for me and I'm gonna do the best I can, we start pointing out like, no, that person is supposed to do this and that person's responsible for this and that person. It's like, chill out. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like, oh, you can only really take responsibility for yourself. And yes, we can as a culture and as a community and as a society. We obviously have to, like, have some rules and some judicial stuff. But I think that's where it just gets a little bit strange for me. And I'm like, okay, like, I don't really know what to do with this. But I think, like I said, I think it's just kind of like an immature or kind of like ill-conceived philosophy of freedom that we start getting these negative side effects.
Where do you guys think we most often blame or fail to take responsibility, like as humans or as Americans or as men or women?
The two things that come to mind are just, first off, specifically it seems with millennials, it's like blaming your parents. And a lot of us haven't grown out of that. And then number two, there's a huge kind of impetus right now to blame the government for things. And I think that's on both sides, left and right, but just like they obviously have different views on what should happen because of that. But yeah, I think those are like the two things, which is like, that's why they call it like, some people call it Big Brother, some people call it like Big Daddy government, right? Because it's like, oh, that's like our parent, right? That's who's supposed to be looking out for us. And it's just like, wait, this is your fault. So I think anytime we can blame our parents or the government, we tend to a lot of times, at least the more mature ones of us do.
I think similar to the government that would just you reminded me of was like the rich, the billionaires.
Mm.
Blaming
Yeah.
which is kind of just a fascinating one. But
Yeah. Which I definitely see that in liberal circles, where, I don't know, left-leaning, liberal, democratic, whatever, progressive, where there is, because obviously they're more on that socialism spectrum where it's like, oh yeah, I think we should all come together as a country and like fund this and fund that, and the government should make sure that there's no homeless people and make sure that this shouldn't be a thing, and make sure everybody has Medicare, make sure everybody has education. Whereas the right-leaning people are essentially like, no, let's make things more private. You have your family takes care of your family, government can handle wars, and that's about it. And that's obviously a generalization, but kind of where those things are leaning. And I think where that does become an issue, and I do hear the right side of the conversation, is that there is this victimized, or like, I don't know what it's called, like you make yourself a victim. Mm-hmm. It's like, yes, we are all victims to an extent, for sure. But what power do you have if you don't take responsibility? You have no power. So all you can continue to do is to put that responsibility, that blame, on a higher power. But then you're just giving the power that you say is victimizing you more power, or right, perpetuating their power. So it's like that is making sense. At some point, yes, you can just say, hey, maybe this isn't all my fault. Maybe there were some overarching forces that did this to me, parents, government, whoever. But at the same time, I need to be responsible for me right now and do the best I can. And yes, I do agree that there's so many social programs, all these things that need to be reformed. But if it doesn't start with you and then your family and then your small community, then it's like, it's not going to be, you're not going to, going back to Frankel, if you don't ever take that responsibility, you're never going to feel that freedom of choice, and you're never going to feel that meaning. Mm-hmm. So you're never going to be happy or satisfied with whatever the results are, even if we get reparations and this and that, you're never going to feel that.
There is a family that has moved like every 10 years or something to restore communities. And it just reminded me of what you said. Do you recall the author?
I don't know.
We'll have to look. I thought maybe it was something we had talked about, but anyways, I'll have to look it up and link it in the show notes. But the gist of it, and I might screw this up because I'm just recalling this, but was that this family and these young kids in the family, I mean, I guess that's what the word implies, but would move to communities that historically had issues, and just like start on their block and like have a cookout and then like involve the local whatever, and then and it would take about 10 years to turn the community from like some point to a more sustaining, helpful, I mean, I don't know, like for a tangible example, I was recently working as a teacher, as a substitute teacher in North Minneapolis, and within Minneapolis, which is the biggest city in all of Minnesota, North Minneapolis is known to be like one of the more, or maybe the most like rough neighborhoods in this whole city. And for the school that I worked at, there was no like parent committee, which is a big part of some schools being really successful. Like the parents would play a big part in raising money and in supporting the school. And like that didn't exist in North Minneapolis for this one school at the time that I was there. And like that example would be something that like this family would move into the community and start. Like, let's get the parent committees running. Let's get the community working for each other better. So yeah, I haven't read the book, but he writes about it and his experience and his family's experience. I thought that was honorable. Also a little bit like aloof, or it's a little savory, I think, but I haven't read the book.
Yeah.
But just what you said, like starting with your home, your block, your whatever, that's what reminded me of the
book. I've heard clean your room before you criticize the world. And with the numbers to back it, if you touch 1,000 people in your lifetime, and each of those 1,000 people touch 1,000 people, you're one lifetime away from impacting a million. And like, I mean, I just think about how many people I encountered through my schooling and through work and social circles and otherwise. And it is, I mean, just like you're saying, to echo and what Lauren is saying too, the importance of starting as an individual and shouldering responsibility. I think it's a super needed message.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bad at taking personal responsibility for my diet. Like, it's easy for me to rationalize, like, stupid reasons to eat something unhealthy. And, like, maybe this is a small example, but I feel like we talked about huge structural things. And, like, it's just really easy for me to be like, oh, I deserve this butter on crackers because I had a bad day. And, like, I don't know, if it was maybe a close friend of mine, it might have even been a counselor of mine. Just, actually, I think I wrote it to myself in a letter, but like at some point.
It might have been like Mahatma Gandhi. I'm okay. No, it was me. Okay.
I'm just.
A wise man once said.
Okay, no, I'm not going to say it. Screw you guys. No, I just, like, at some point you have to tell yourself, or Gandhi has to tell you, or someone has to tell you to grow the F up and, like, take responsibility for your, actions. Like, no, you don't deserve to eat a pail of ice cream. Like, that's unhealthy. Nobody should ever do that. Like, no, you don't deserve to go cheat on your husband because he's been bad to you. Like, that's a crappy thing to do. No, you don't deserve to, whatever it is. Like, I think a lot of people say, and I hear it often, I deserve this. And it's like, what do you mean you deserve that? And I know it's maybe a little bit different than, like, taking responsibility for your actions, but I think, like, we make a lot of bad choices in the name of deserving it, and then we don't take responsibility after because we deserved it. And often those decisions are unhealthy. Anyways, that's my aside.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that deserving thing, that entitlement is interesting because even entitlement it has the connotation of being undeserved, or like you didn't earn it yourself. It was bestowed upon you, right? It's like the divine rights of Englishmen and all that type of stuff. It is really interesting. There's definitely is this complex in us, at least in America, where we kind of have this feeling of entitlement. And then, like you said, I don't know if I would probably have to think about it more to eloquently articulate it, but yeah, to your point, the deserving and the entitlement then doesn't lead to any further responsibility for the consequences. There is some weird exoneration mentally that happens. It's really fascinating.
And it goes, I would say, both ways. Like, I mean, there have been awful things that have happened to me, and like the first time I was raped, I walked away and for a year after told myself I deserved it. Like, why is that? You know, I mean, like, it can go both ways. Where, I mean, yeah, it's like whether I'm justifying 6 drinks instead of 2 that I had 2 weeks ago. I deserved those 6 drinks. I worked hard that week. Or I'm justifying something worse in my own life. It's like, I deserved to be raped. Like, I don't know, like, what that is, but I think it's a big problem, and I think it's somewhere tied to freedom and responsibility. I'm not exactly sure how. I didn't research any of this. It's all just, like, coming to my mind right now. But
I think so. So the idea of rights is, like, funny in some way because, like, it involves putting the responsibility onto other people. So if, like, I say I have a right to like universal health care as an example, like, that's like putting the responsibility on myself paying taxes, but if I lose my job, like, the community to pay taxes and, like, take on the responsibility of my health care. And I think that that's like kind of associated with what you're talking about the deserved, is it's like, oh, I'm taking this. It's kind of like the blaming. It's like, oh, I'm taking this responsibility that may or may not be on my shoulders, but like we're taking it here and we're putting it there. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's where I think like that the like deserved piece comes from, which is like this weird, I mean, it is this weird like psychological mind game where it's like, oh, if like responsibility is the way to meaning, why do we tend to, or it seems like we tend to take this responsibility and put it on others.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think in the flip side, which, like, instead of putting on others, we're putting something that we're not responsible for on us, as you talked about. I think that could also be like a pathological conclusion to the ideas of freedom and obviously justice as well. It's like, yeah, because again, as Sartre said, total freedom, which a lot of Americans think we have, something we are inculcated with. That means total responsibility. So therefore, whatever happens to you, you deserved it, right? Whether good or bad. That is something that we could internalize. And obviously sometimes, I don't know, like the word deserve is just like,
right.
That's such a loaded word in general. But
yeah,
yeah, obviously, like no one deserves any sort of atrocity, as like what you're speaking of, no one deserves to get raped. So it does seem to be like I'm not a fucking psychoanalyst, but just in the context of our conversation of freedom and responsibility, I could see that internalization as a culture, and for some people like yourself, obviously.
So tell us about Sartre. My research didn't bring me to the name at all, so I am unfamiliar.
So Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher, he essentially wrote the blueprint for existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy essentially about human existence and specifically separating us from any sort of divine comeuppance, right? It's just like, no, we're here, we exist. Let's figure this shit out as human beings. It's like, it's just us. So he's kind of, existentialism is kind of one of these things that descends from the ideas of Nietzsche, like God is dead, right? No one's here to take responsibility for us. No one's here to guide us. It's up to us as a species and as individuals to do it. And some of the pillars that Sartre laid out. So number one, the most important, maybe not the most important, but the one that kind of, I suppose, gives existentialism its name, is existence precedes essence. Existence, so us living, us becoming into being, comes before essence, which would be purpose or meaning. Again, that comes with like God. There's no God that's out here telling us what to do. And then number two would be each person, and this one is really fascinating, and I've got, it's really interesting. Number two, each person is responsible for all people.
I agree 100%.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That one is really, really, that's a big claim. But I've heard it so often through our conversations, and obviously as Americans, like we have differing, it's like, what does freedom mean? Like I talk about the freedom from bonds, the freedom from, if I am my own free thinker and own free person who's completely in control, and you are too, how do I have any responsibility for you? That's you, right? If I want to move away from my family and do this and like disregard all my prior obligations that normal humans or like throughout human history we've had, I can do that. But Sartre is like, no, you're totally free, but you also totally responsible. So no, you can't. Like you're responsible. Not only are you responsible for your family, your kids, your siblings, whoever, all people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's part of the reason I sponsor a child. And like people, well, I don't know, people don't ask me about it, but Aidan asked me about it once, I guess. And that was kind of my answer. I think there were other reasons too. Like I also believe in human potential. And like I sponsor a kid in Uganda, and Uganda as a country is like near and dear to my heart. But it's like, yeah, we live in a world of orphans, and I believe that I have some responsibility to orphans in general. Mm-hmm. And so like if I chose a country and I'm sponsoring an orphan, like it's because I should be. I feel similarly about giving blood. Like, I don't think I deserve a gold star for either of those things. I believe that people have a personal responsibility to do something about orphans, like, or to do something about the people who can't give blood. So I do.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, I don't
Because you have the choice.
talk about it often, and I'm not like waving it around. But like, yeah, I think you should do it too.
Yeah. Okay. We might come back to that.
Okay.
Third point. Each is condemned to freedom. Each person is condemned to freedom. So that obviously sheds a lot of light on everything we've talked about, what freedom is, responsibility, too much freedom can be a prison, all that type of stuff. So 1, existence precedes essence. 2, each person is responsible for all people. 3, each person is condemned to freedom. And there's kind of 3, based on my understanding of how it works, there's kind of 3 bullet points under the condemnation into freedom, which it's anguish, which is the total and deep understanding of responsibility. That gives you anguish, or it could. Forlornness, which the word forlorn means like feel alone, abandoned. And that comes from the idea that like God is dead. There isn't any big figure that's responsible for you. You're responsible for you. And then lastly, despair. Man is nothing but his life and his actions. So that can lead to despair, that there isn't any greater thing. There's nothing like it can save you from, right? There's no like Christian redemption or like blood that's going to redeem you and bring you back. It's like you are your life and your actions specifically. Not what you try to do, not what you think you're going to do, not your intention, not your belief, your actions.
Viktor Frankl wrote about feeling free even in Auschwitz because he was free to choose to have meaningful suffering. That came to mind as Viktor Frankl wrote about feeling free even in Auschwitz because he could choose to find meaning in his suffering. And for him, that was to one day be reunited with his wife, actually.
Because while your body may be imprisoned, your mind is free.
To, like, yeah, feel or choose freedom. So the condemned to freedom.
At the very least, your mind is.
I resonate with. I think, too, well, I struggle a little with the word condemned, too, because I would say, like, we are slaves to freedom, maybe. Condemned to, maybe that's one and the same. But I would like to believe that, like, in the light of Viktor Frankl, even if your world is really crappy and things are not going your way, like, you can choose to have meaningful suffering, or you can choose to have meaningful freedom.
I think so. Yeah, I think to the choice of the word condemned to freedom is or might be challenged in some ways when, like, I think about Steven Pinker talk in his book Enlightenment Now, and then there's another book on my docket called The Rational Optimist, and it's just like how humanity, because of like the price of goods going down, the standard of living on average, at least in the US, for sure is rising. And then, I mean, in many developing countries, especially since the 70s, people have been lifted out of poverty. And I think that, like, from that, and then also decreased violence on like a bigger picture scale, I think that, like, that freedom can also, and the sequence of a life and actions can also permit the possibility, at least, of building something good in something like where there is a world where there is as little suffering, or at least meaningful suffering, or the most meaningful suffering, like available. I think that, yeah, I guess that's where maybe I would, like, I see where freedom can be torturing in some ways, but I think that it also permits the possibility of positive outcomes.
Yeah. I'm saying that condemned is a sticky point for us. Yeah, I think that Sartre, for sure, he lived a troubled life like many great philosophers. You know, he had some afflictions as a child and all that type of stuff. And I do think that he does believe there is, like he says, like anguish is a product of freedom, the understanding that you are a free being, along with forlornness and despair, which those are very powerful words and powerful emotions and powerful states of consciousness. Nevertheless, I don't think that he sees existentialism as, I think when he says condemnation, I don't think he's putting a value judgment on it. I think he's only saying you are condemned, you are sentenced to, you don't have a choice but to be free. That's all I think he's saying. And yes, there are, it doesn't matter, like you have to pick your poison in life. Either way, like if you're going to be, okay, we don't have freedom, we're deterministic by some cosmic being or this universe or whatever, or you're sentenced to, you are free and you do have all this responsibility and you do have the choices and you are morally responsible. Either way, you are going to be condemned. I'm not sure that he was necessarily putting a value judgment on it. Yes, of course, he thinks that the fact that we're free can lend itself to positive things. Sure. I believe that he definitely thought that. I just think it's just more like you're sentenced to this as soon as you're born. Before you were born, nothing you can do about it. This is who we are. And because he was I think he died in like 1970 or something. So his time was still a very religious time. But also he was French. So they're also going through all these revolutions and renaissances and this and that. So he just, as you have to do when you're trying to be a revolutionary or a great thinker, you can't just be like mealy mouthed and like kind of like, hey, like you kind of like, hey, you got, you have to like make a statement. Like, so he's using these powerful words for a reason to get people's attention and to let people know like, hey, like, like you got a reaction on you guys, right? It's like, that's like condemned to freedom. Like that's a powerful phrase.
It makes you think.
Yeah. So I think that all those things kind of come together. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. He could be right. Maybe I found a lot of interesting things in there. I think, again, because my ideas on free will, because it's just a whole type of freedom, right? Free will, like freedom of choice because you have a government, like freedom, whatever, like all the amendments, the Bill of Rights, all that type of stuff. There's different types of freedom. But I think I definitely disagree with a lot of what, maybe not what he said, but at least how people have interpreted his work and how existentialism and freedom of will and all that has manifested. But I think, like at the end of the day, under this umbrella of determinism, if we want to say we have these freedoms, I'm like, it seems to be that way. It's important to act in that way. And I really did like, though, because to me, it always felt like, oh, if we have free will, then like it does seem like a freedom from almost everything else too. But it's like, no, you are responsible for every single person. So when you make a decision, think about that. It's kind of very Kantian. It's like, if everybody made this decision, could human race prosper? And it's like, okay, if not, then don't do that, right? Don't steal, don't do this, don't murder, don't blah, blah. And I think where I kind of stand on it, I think on a micro level, I'm pretty individualistic, pretty like do whatever you want. Don't worry too much about what people think. Don't worry too much what your family needs, all that on a micro level. But then when you get to a macro level where it's like, whether that be like more people or more just like harsher consequences, like death or something, then I think I get pretty like, hey, you're responsible for everybody. Hey, we're all in this together. Hey, we're all a human race. Like, you can't just go live whatever life you want. It's like, we have to come together as a human race to like achieve our apotheosis.
Yeah. I think a big part of that is understanding what community means and what being, a community member should look like or could look like.
What is being a community member?
It means that when you are in 9th grade, if you are thinking about daring one of your other fellow classmates to jump out the window, someone freaking says something before the student jumps out the window, because you know it's a dumb idea. That's what it means. Yep.
Can you give me a second definition?
I thought that sufficed.
That was a great definition.
There's a concept called apoptosis in multicellular organisms where a cell will self-destruct for the greater good of the entire being. If we extrapolate this to a society, a community, I'm curious, in light of obviously the freedom and the each person is responsible for every person, when does an entity, whether it be a cell or an organ or a plant or a human, whatever, when do they decide to self-sacrifice for the greater good of the whole? What does that take?
Or do they decide?
The cell, maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, it's pretty programmed biologically, and because of that, I would imagine that the self-destruction is inherent if it's necessary. So like in the body, only would apoptosis happen, only would the cell die when it's necessary. And that's pre-programmed, it's predetermined. So that I would carry on to society. However, we also know that there are times where the body should have apoptosis and the cell keeps growing, and that is why we have cancer today. And we don't have a way to cure it, and we don't have a way to save the entity, really. And so I wonder too if what you're thinking of is the larger problems of society, if that could be like the cancer of society. That's
a fascinating, so to just like where my mind went is I've seen a graph where like drinking alcohol has been going down for younger, like over generations in the US at least, on average in terms of like the amount drank over a certain time period. And I was thinking about, oh, maybe that's like because of the internet and seeing like the examples of what they don't want, and like hearing of examples of what they don't want to be like. So like I don't want to be like this alcoholic that so-and-so knew or whatever. Like I think that like that's a fascinating take in the apoptosis and like cancer regard, like at a societal level. Like if at a societal level we do need some like blight like that of self-destruction to point more people or most people in the right direction, like because I mean for me at least in the job and profession space, I've learned a lot about what I don't want, and that's like been most informative, honestly, in terms of making my future decisions. Is like, oh, I don't want this, okay, I'm going to choose this, and then like I realize I don't want that, I'm going to choose this going forward. So it's kind of just a fascinating like extrapolation, if like maybe at a species level some of this, obviously we don't want like it to get to cancer levels, and like it's tragic that it happens at all, but like I think about it in that example at least, and to me it makes a ton of sense. Well, we're getting close to time, and we haven't really talked at all about like legal responsibility. And I'm not sure that pivoting there makes sense with not much time left, but I do just want to
to say, which, yeah, we don't have to talk about. But I do just want to say that given everything that I've just said, I don't know that we should hold people as legally responsible with the same consequences that we do today. Like, I think as a society, we're not doing a very good job of being stewards of like good choices versus bad choices.
I agree. Socrates said that nobody with the sufficient amount of information ever makes a wrong decision. So for me, there's just, in order for you to make these decisions, you had to have some sort of wrong information or programming. So therefore, yes, because we are a functioning society with not too many other outlets, we do need prisons. But to your point, there needs to be some reform. We're not handling them in a compassionate enough way, and our draconian prison system has not kept up with the science.
Yeah, I agree. And I just don't know that, like, I really do believe that, like, knowledge is power. And so if you could get all the information, I really believe that you would not make that choice again. And so, like, some of these 20, 30, 50 lifetime sentences just to me seem quite absurd. And I obviously am not an expert, but just that's my like personal thought when it comes to responsibility to the law. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, eh?
I mean, I agree that it is extreme. I do think that there is, to some extent, a purpose and like it does help some, does improve some of our society's functioning, having, like, I mean, I think, I mean, punishment is a motivator to get people to like nudge in like perhaps a more helpful direction. And I definitely agree with you guys that the prison system needs catching up and needs to move towards like a more health centric and healing and trying to like help people get to a better place. I do think that, like, I mean, I think about like parking fines. There's definitely issues with those for sure in terms of people getting trapped with parking fines. But like to get people to not park in that location, if that's what is needed, like that's a pretty effective means. So I don't know. Yeah, just to like, I guess, add that 2 cents, and that stuff's complicated.
All right, common scientists. Well, we don't have all the answers. We're just out here asking questions and doing some exploration. I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation on freedom and versus responsibility, whichever you choose. I know I had fun in the conversation, and we look forward to hearing from you guys and continuing to see you guys tune in next time.
Hey, common scientists. Hope you enjoyed the cast. Thanks for investing in common science. We hope it brought as much value to you as it did to us.
To learn more, smash the subscribe button and visit our website, commonscientists.com, where you can read our blog, join our email newsletter, and follow us on social media.
Finally, if you like what we have to say, you can absolutely support us on Patreon. We could always use more support. You can navigate there also from our website, commonscientists.com, common scientists with an S, so that we can continue cultivating a community of common scientists.